In the early months of 1941, as the Mediterranean became one of the most contested battlefields of World War II, British intelligence began laying the groundwork for a shadow war few would ever hear about. The public saw the headlines, the sieges, the naval engagements, the desert offensives. But beneath the surface, a quieter struggle was unfolding. This was not the war of grand armies or tank divisions. It was a war of deception, sabotage, and secrecy, fought in the margins of history. The Mediterranean had become the lifeline of the British Empire's war effort. Control of these waters meant access to Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the vital oil of the Middle East. But by mid-1941, Axis forces, led by General Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps, threatened to choke that lifeline. The Royal Navy was stretched thin, convoys to Malta were under constant attack, and the North African front teetered on collapse. In London, Winston Churchill demanded new answers, unconventional answers. "Set Europe ablaze," he famously ordered the newly formed Special Operations Executive. The SOE, its mission, to wage war in secret, using any means necessary. From a nondescript building at 64 Baker Street, SOE planners began coordinating covert missions that stretched from the coast of North Africa to the islands of the Aegean. Codenames like Scorpio, Mincemeat, and Postmaster were whispered among officers, though few knew their true nature. The agents selected for these operations were drawn from the most diverse corners of the British Empire: commandos, linguists, demolitions experts, and former adventurers. They trained at secret facilities in Scotland and the Middle East, mastering everything from sabotage to disguise. In Cairo, the SOE's Middle East headquarters, known cryptically as Force 133, became the nerve center for Mediterranean operations. From here, British officers coordinated resistance networks in Greece, Crete, and Yugoslavia, and prepared daring missions to strike Axis shipping lines. But secrecy came at a cost. Even within the British military, many saw the SOE as reckless and uncontrollable. General Claude Auchinlec's staff often complained that these cloak and dagger men risked diplomatic incidents and reprisals that could derail broader strategic goals. Yet for Churchill, results mattered more than decorum. The Mediterranean was a chessboard of opportunity. Spain, though officially neutral, leaned toward the Axis. Vichy France controlled Syria and Lebanon. Italy's navy dominated the central sea lanes. The British needed operations that could unsettle this balance. And they needed them quickly. The answer lay in covert action, carried out under absolute silence. Among the earliest missions conceived was a bold plan to strike directly at the Axis supply network. Not through open combat, but through subterfuge. Ships, warehouses, and communication nodes became targets for small teams of operatives trained to move unseen. Some missions would succeed spectacularly. Others would vanish into obscurity, their participants unrecognized, their outcomes never fully recorded. Years later, fragments of these operations began to surface. Classified documents released under the British Public Records Act, or cryptic diary entries found in the belongings of retired officers. They spoke of daring raids on neutral territory, mysterious disappearances, and intelligence coups that shaped the war in unseen ways. One such file described an unauthorized naval seizure conducted off Fernando Po. Another referred to an incident in the Aegean, involving missing personnel from the Special Boat Section. The deeper historians looked, the more questions emerged. How many secret missions had the British undertaken in the Mediterranean, and how many were never meant to be known? Even today, much of this hidden war remains buried beneath layers of classification and diplomatic sensitivity. What little we do know comes from declassified reports, memoirs, and interviews with the few surviving agents who dared to speak. Their stories describe a world where deception was the most powerful weapon, and silence the price of survival. In one 1946 interview, an SOE officer, Major Harry Bill Martin, reflected on those early days. "We were ghosts in uniform. You never asked who someone was or what they'd done. You just knew that tomorrow they might not be there." His words captured the essence of this invisible conflict, a war of quiet bravery and moral ambiguity, fought in the shadows of history. As 1941 turned to 1942, the SOE's operations expanded in scope and audacity. Each mission seemed more improbable than the last, hijacking ships in neutral harbors, deceiving entire enemy commands, or destroying vital infrastructure deep within occupied territories. These were not conventional victories. yet their impact rippled across the war's outcome. And among these secret undertakings, one operation would set the standard for every covert mission that followed. A mission so daring, so diplomatically explosive, that it would be buried under official silence for decades. It began with a handful of men, a few fishing boats, and a target hidden in the neutral waters off the coast of Spanish Africa. The world would come to know it as Operation Postmaster, the first of the 5 most hidden British operations in the Mediterranean. In January 1942, while the world's attention remained fixed on the great tank battles in North Africa, a small group of British agents prepared for a mission that would never appear in official reports. Its objective: to seize enemy ships anchored in a neutral port, an act so provocative that, if discovered, it could have dragged Spain into the war on the side of the Axis. This was Operation Postmaster, one of the most audacious and secretive British missions of World War II. The setting was Fernando Po, a tiny Spanish-controlled island off the coast of West Africa, now known as Bioko in Equatorial Guinea. Its main harbour, Santa Isabel, had become a quiet refuge for Axis vessels, supply ships, repair tugs, and communication links vital to Germany's U-boat campaign in the Atlantic. British intelligence believed these ships were feeding information to German submarines attacking Allied convoys, using their neutral status as a shield. To the SOE, that made them legitimate targets. To the rest of the world, they were untouchable. The man tasked with carrying out this operation was Major Gustavus Gus March Phillips, leader of the newly formed small-scale raiding force, SSRF, an elite offshoot of British commandos. A daring and unorthodox officer, March Phillips had been handpicked by the SOE for missions requiring creativity and nerve. His team included the legendary Anders Lassen, a Danish commando later awarded the Victoria Cross, and a handful of Royal Navy volunteers under Lieutenant Geoffrey Appleyard. Their orders were simple but perilous: infiltrate the neutral harbour, seize 3 Axis vessels, and tow them out to sea, without alerting Spanish authorities or causing casualties. The planning was meticulous and wrapped in layers of deception. Operating under the guise of a commercial salvage company, the British established a front base in nearby Lagos, Nigeria. From there, they chartered a small tug, Vulcan, and a larger vessel, Nuneaton, disguised as merchant ships. The intelligence groundwork was laid by the British Vice-Consul in Santa Isabel, a man named Frank Slater, who secretly passed information about Spanish patrol routines and harbour defences to the SOE. Every move had to be timed to avoid diplomatic disaster. On the night of January 14, 1942, the operation commenced. Under the cover of tropical darkness, Vulcan approached the harbour towing 2 small motor launches filled with commandos. Local African seamen, recruited for their skill and silence, helped the British navigate the reef-lined channel. The air was heavy with humidity and tension. One mistake could expose them to Spanish gunboats, or worse, the German agents stationed on the island. Moving swiftly and silently, March Phillips' men boarded the first target, the Duchessa d'Aosta, a 7,000-ton Italian merchant ship. The guards, caught completely off guard, were disarmed without resistance. Within minutes, the boarding teams attached towing cables and cut the anchor chains. Nearby, Lassen and Appleyard secured 2 smaller German vessels, the Lecombe and the Baibundi, using similar precision. The only sound was the groaning of metal as the ships were pulled free from their moorings. By dawn, the stolen ships were miles out to sea, steaming toward Lagos under British escort. When Spanish officials discovered the theft hours later, they were stunned. The harbour was empty, the guards unharmed, and the culprits gone without a trace. The British government, when questioned, issued a complete denial. "No such operation has been undertaken," declared an official statement from London. Behind closed doors, Churchill personally approved decorations for the men involved, but ordered the entire affair classified under the highest secrecy. Operation Postmaster achieved more than its tactical goal. It sent a chilling message across the Mediterranean. Nowhere were Axis assets truly safe, not even in neutral waters. German intelligence fumed over the breach of Spanish sovereignty, yet could prove nothing. The SOE, emboldened by success, began planning more daring Mediterranean missions, each pushing the boundaries of legality and risk. Yet even among those who carried it out, the operation left questions. Why had it been authorized at such political risk? What broader strategy justified antagonizing Spain, a country Britain desperately needed to remain neutral. Some historians suggest it was a test, an experiment to gauge the limits of covert warfare. Others believe the ships carried more than supplies, perhaps sensitive codes or intelligence materials that made their capture worth the gamble. Whatever the truth, it was locked away in British archives for decades. The official records remained sealed until the 1970s, when fragments of correspondence between the Admiralty and SOE headquarters were declassified. They revealed just how close the mission had come to sparking a diplomatic crisis, and how deliberately the story had been buried. Major March Phillips would never live to see the full recognition of his achievement. Later that same year, he was killed during another raid off the French coast. His name, for years, remained unknown to the public. His operations erased from history books until long after the war's end. Operation Postmaster was the spark that ignited the British shadow war in the Mediterranean. It proved that stealth, deception, and psychological audacity could strike harder than any battleship gun, but it also opened the door to even greater gambits. Missions where the weapon was not force, but illusion. In the months that followed, British intelligence would take deception to an unprecedented level. Their next plan would not steal ships or sabotage rails. It would rewrite the very intelligence files of the enemy, and it would begin with a single corpse drifting off the coast of Spain. In the spring of 1943, an unassuming corpse washed ashore near the Spanish port of Huelva. Local fishermen discovered the body, dressed in a Royal Marine uniform, clutching a briefcase chained to his wrist. Within days, the find would set in motion one of the most successful deception operations of the Second World War. It was called Operation Mincemeat, a plan so audacious, so improbable, that even its creators doubted it would work. Yet, it would help change the course of the Mediterranean War. By early 1943, the Allies had driven Axis forces out of North Africa and were preparing to invade southern Europe. The next logical step was Italy, but German intelligence already anticipated that. To ensure the success of Operation Husky, the planned invasion of Sicily, the British needed to convince Hitler that the real target lay elsewhere, Greece and Sardinia. The task fell to two intelligence officers in London, Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague of the Royal Navy and Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of MI5. Their assignment was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Plant false invasion plans on a dead man and ensure they reached German hands. The idea had been first proposed years earlier by Naval Intelligence Officer Ian Fleming. Yes, the future creator of James Bond, in a memo suggesting the use of corpses carrying deceptive documents. Now, with Churchill's approval and the backing of Admiral John Godfrey, the concept would be turned into reality. The operation's first challenge was grim: finding the right body. After exhaustive and discreet inquiries through London's morgues, the team secured the remains of a homeless Welshman named Glyndwr Michael, who had died after ingesting rat poison. His death was tragic, his life anonymous, but in death he would become a hero of deception. The body was transformed into Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, a fictional officer complete with personal effects, theatre ticket stubs, love letters from a fabricated fiancée named Pam, and even a photograph of her. The illusion was painstakingly authentic, down to minor details like laundry, receipts, and identification cards. Inside the briefcase, chained to Major Martin's wrist, were carefully prepared top-secret documents, hinting at Allied plans to invade Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. The paperwork was designed to appear convincingly bureaucratic. Letters between generals, references to non-existent units, and coded allusions only genuine officers would recognize. The brilliance lay not in the documents themselves, but in how they were meant to be lost. On the night of April 30th, 1943, the British submarine HMS Seraph surfaced off the coast of Spain. Its crew, sworn to absolute secrecy, performed a macabre ritual. They gently released the body of Major Martin into the waves, letting the tide carry it towards Spanish territory. Spain, though officially neutral, was crawling with German agents. The British gamble was that the corpse would be discovered, the documents examined by the Spaniards, and then, quietly, passed to the Germans. Days later, word reached the British Embassy in Madrid. A body matching their fabricated officer had indeed been found. the Spanish authorities performed a perfunctory investigation, during which the Germans managed to photograph and copy the contents of the briefcase. The deception had worked perfectly. The false intelligence made its way up the chain of command, to Admiral Karl Dönitz, then to the Abwehr, and finally to Adolf Hitler himself. Hitler was convinced. Believing the Allies would strike Greece, he ordered reinforcements diverted from Sicily to the Balkans. Panzer divisions were repositioned, and Luftwaffe squadrons reassigned to the wrong theatre. When Allied forces landed in Sicily on July 9, 1943, they faced far lighter resistance than expected. The deception had not just succeeded, it had saved thousands of lives and accelerated Italy's collapse. Back in London, Montagu and Cholmondeley received quiet commendations. Officially, Major Martin was recorded as a genuine casualty of the war, buried with full military honours in Huelva's cemetery. His headstone still bears his false name, the epitaph reading, "Greater love hath no man than this." The true identity of the man behind the legend remained classified until 1998, when declassified files finally revealed him as Glinda Michael, a man who never lived as a soldier but became one in death. Yet beneath the triumph, the operation carried a darker undercurrent. Its success hinged on the manipulation of both friend and foe, and on the use of a human body as a weapon. Intelligence officers later admitted to a haunting unease. In Montagu's private notes, he wrote, "We sent a man who had no more choice in his mission than the thousands who die unrecorded. May he rest, knowing he served his country well." Operation Mincemeat redefined deception warfare. It was the ultimate fusion of imagination and ruthlessness, proof that the pen and the typewriter could be deadlier than the gun. But it also signaled a turning point. As the Allies advanced across the Mediterranean, the British learned that secrecy itself could become a weapon more powerful than firepower. In the shadows of occupied Greece, that lesson was about to be tested once again. The next British operation in the Mediterranean would not rely on illusion, but on sheer courage, and explosives strapped to a mountain bridge in the heart of enemy territory. That mission would be known as Operation Harling. In the dark of night on November 25, 1942, a thunderous explosion echoed through the mountains of central Greece. The Gorgopotamus Viaduct, a critical railway bridge linking Athens with Thessaloniki, had been reduced to twisted steel and shattered concrete. The destruction sent shockwaves not just through Axis command, but through the heart of occupied Europe. This was Operation Harling, a daring act of sabotage carried out deep behind enemy lines, orchestrated by the British Special Operations Executive with the help of Greek partisans. It was one of the most successful, yet politically fraught, missions of the entire Mediterranean campaign. The origins of Operation Harling lay in the Allied struggle to disrupt Axis supply lines to North Africa. By mid-1942, Rommel's Africa Corps depended on supplies shipped through Greece and Crete, then transported via the Balkans and the Aegean to North African ports. British intelligence believed that cutting these routes could choke off Rommel's logistics and ease the pressure on Montgomery's 8th Army, then preparing for the decisive battle at El Alamein. To achieve this, SOE headquarters in Cairo devised a plan to destroy one of three key viaducts in Greece, Asopos, Papadia, or Gorgopotamos, all heavily guarded and strategically vital to the Axis war effort. The operations field leader was Colonel Edmund "Eddie" Myers of the Royal Engineers, supported by Major Christopher Monty Woodhouse, a classical scholar turned guerrilla liaison officer. They were joined by a team of 10 specially trained British commandos, demolition experts, and radio operators. Their task was simple to describe but nearly impossible to execute. Parachute into the mountains of central Greece, make contact with the fragmented resistance groups, and organize a coordinated attack under the noses of the occupying German and Italian forces. The drop took place on the night of September 29, 1942, as the RAF transport aircraft roared over the Pindus Mountains. Strong winds scattered the men and their equipment across the rugged terrain. It took weeks for the operatives to regroup. Isolated, short on supplies, and unfamiliar with the local geography, they were entirely dependent on the goodwill of Greek villagers who risked death for aiding them. Despite the setbacks, Myers managed to establish contact with two major resistance factions, the communist-led ELAS under Aris Voluciotis and the Republican EDES led by Napoleon Zervas. The two groups had been bitter enemies, each vying for control of post-war Greece. But for one night, under British persuasion, They would fight side by side. In his post-war memoirs, Woodhouse recalled the delicate negotiations. "We faced not just the enemy, but suspicion from those who might have been our allies. Convincing them that this was Greece's fight as much as ours was harder than placing the explosives." Nevertheless, a truce was struck, and a combined force of nearly 150 partisans and British commandos assembled near the Gorgopotamos Bridge. The operation began shortly before midnight. Italian sentries patrolled the bridge, unaware of the movement in the shadows below. British engineers crept to the base of the structure, carrying specially prepared explosive charges fitted with delayed fuses. Partisan squads cut telephone wires and set ambushes along the approach roads, while a diversionary force engaged the nearby garrison in a firefight. The battle raged for over 2 hours, the night sky illuminated by tracer fire and the glow of burning fuel. At 1:30 a.m., the charges detonated in a sequence of deafening blasts. 2 spans of the viaduct collapsed into the riverbed below, completely severing the north-south railway line. The success was immediate and total. The Axis supply chain through Greece was cut for 6 crucial weeks, forcing the Germans to reroute through Yugoslavia and Bulgaria. British radio operators transmitted a coded message back to Cairo. Operation Harling complete. Bridge destroyed. Casualties light. In London, Churchill personally commended the mission, calling it a striking example of the courage and ingenuity of our men and their gallant Greek comrades. But behind the triumph lay a deeper tension. The unity forged at Gorgopotamos proved fleeting. Within months, Elis and Eddies turned their weapons on each other, plunging Greece into a civil conflict that foreshadowed the turmoil of the post-war years. For the SOE, it was a sobering reminder that victory in the field did not always translate to political stability. Even as they celebrated, British officers realized the success of Harling had unleashed forces they could no longer control. One surviving partisan later reflected, "That night we fought as Greeks, not factions, but by morning, the mistrust returned." His words echoed the complexity of covert warfare, where every triumph carried the seeds of new conflict. After the war, the Gorgopotamos Bridge was rebuilt, and the operation became a symbol of resistance. Yet, for decades, much of the mission's documentation remained classified, partly due to the sensitive alliances it exposed. It wasn't until the 1980s that the full details of the British involvement were officially acknowledged. In Greece, a monument now stands at the site, honouring both the British and Greek fighters who risked everything that night. For the SOE, Operation Harling proved the power of collaboration and the danger of meddling in the politics of occupied nations. Still, its success emboldened British command to launch even more daring operations across the Mediterranean islands, where German airfields and communication hubs posed a constant threat to Allied naval routes. The next chapter of this hidden war would unfold on the sun-scorched island of Crete, where a handful of British commandos would strike at the heart of the Axis air power. Their mission would be swift, surgical, and shrouded in disappearance. It would be remembered as Operation Albumen. In the summer of 1943, the island of Crete stood as one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Axis-controlled Mediterranean. German paratroopers had seized it 2 years earlier in a brutal airborne invasion, leaving thousands dead on both sides. Since then, Crete had become a key operational hub for the Luftwaffe, its airfields at Heraklion, Timpaki, and Kastelli allowing Axis bombers to strike Allied convoys and bases across the eastern Mediterranean. To the British Special Operations Executive, this island was not just a stronghold, it was a dagger aimed at the heart of every Allied supply line. The solution was as daring as it was desperate. Destroy the airfields, cripple the Axis presence, and do it without open warfare. This was Operation Albumen. The mission was conceived by the Middle East headquarters of the SOE in early 1943, following the success of Operation Harling in Greece. The objective was clear: to sabotage German aircraft and infrastructure on Crete through coordinated night raids. But the challenge was immense. The island was crawling with Wehrmacht patrols, Gestapo informants, and collaborationist militias. Communication with the local resistance was tenuous at best. Still, plans went forward. The operation would be divided into 4 separate strikes, targeting airfields at Kastelli, Timpaki, Heraklion, and Maleme. Each team would consist of a handful of British commandos and local partisans, men trained to move, strike, and vanish like shadows. Among the leaders was Captain Michael "Mike" Cumberledge, a Royal Navy officer with experience in covert coastal raids, and Lieutenant David Sutherland, an engineer known for his cool precision under pressure. They operated under the overall coordination of Major Tom Dunbabin, the SOE liaison officer in Crete, who had already built ties with the Cretan resistance. Their mission brief was succinct: infiltrate, destroy, and escape. No uniforms, no insignia, no possibility of rescue if caught. The teams landed on Crete by submarine and fishing kayaks under moonless skies, carrying explosives disguised as wine casks and farm tools. Moving inland through goat paths and olive groves, they relied entirely on the local Andates, the Cretan resistance fighters who had sworn vengeance since the brutal reprisals following the 1941 invasion. These men and women risked everything, knowing that discovery meant execution for entire villages. On the night of June 7, 1943, the first group struck Castelli airfield in western Crete. Under the cover of darkness, British and Cretan saboteurs infiltrated the perimeter, cutting through barbed wire with surgical precision. They planted time-delayed charges on fuel depots and parked aircraft. Minutes later, the night exploded in sheets of flame. 20 Axis aircraft were destroyed, their fuel tanks erupting into pillars of fire visible from miles away. The attackers slipped into the hills before German reinforcements arrived. Simultaneously, another team led by Lieutenant Sutherland targeted the airfield at Timpaki on the island's southern coast. They faced heavier defenses, but managed to destroy several aircraft and ammunition dumps before retreating toward the mountains. Heraklion proved more difficult. There, Captain Cumberledge's team ran into unexpected patrols. A firefight erupted. Some agents were wounded. The mission was partially successful, but in the chaos of the withdrawal, several men went missing, including Cumberledge himself. For weeks, nothing was heard from them. Radio messages from Cairo received only static. When contact was finally re-established through local resistance, the reports were grim. Cumberledge and several of his men had been captured by German forces near Heraklion. They were tortured, interrogated, and executed under orders of the Gestapo. Their bodies were never recovered. For the SOE, it was a devastating blow. The men had known the risks, but the loss underscored the brutal stakes of the Shadow War. Still, despite the casualties, Operation Albumen achieved its goal. Over 40 German aircraft were destroyed across multiple airfields, crippling Luftwaffe operations in the region for months. The raids also boosted Allied morale and galvanized the Greek resistance. Yet, the disappearance of the Cumberledge team cast a haunting shadow over the success. For decades, their fate remained an enigma, lost amid incomplete war diaries and redacted intelligence files. Some locals claimed to have seen them march through Heraklion under heavy guard. Others whispered they had been shot near the village of Alikianos. No official record confirms their final moments. Years after the war, fragments of truth began to surface. In 1956, a declassified SOE memo acknowledged the probable execution of personnel associated with Operation Albumen, Heraklion's sector. It was the first formal recognition that these men had been left behind, victims of a mission too secret for rescue. Their names were later engraved on the Brookwood Memorial in England, honouring those with no known grave. Cumberledge's son, Mark, himself a naval officer, once visited Crete to trace his father's steps. In his journal he wrote, "He fought a war no one could see. His weapons were silence and courage. If he vanished, it was only because that was how he was meant to fight." Those words captured the essence of the SOE's Mediterranean campaign, fought in darkness, often unacknowledged, yet vital to the Allied victory. Operation Albumen closed one chapter of the Mediterranean's Shadow War, but it opened another, a quieter, more secretive struggle, fought through coded messages, forged documents, and unseen hands. As 1944 approached, the tide of war was turning, but the SOE's mission was far from over. Even as the Allies pushed north through Italy, British operatives continued to wage a hidden battle for control of the Mediterranean. And as the guns of war began to fall silent, another mystery remained. What became of the men and missions that never returned? Their deeds buried beneath the weight of secrecy. The final chapter of this hidden history would piece together the fragments, declassified files, fading photographs, and the voices of the few who survived. It would be the story of how the truth of these Mediterranean operations was finally revealed, long after the war had ended, when the shadows themselves began to speak. By the late summer of 1945, the guns of war had fallen silent, but for the men and women of Britain's shadow armies, peace brought not relief, but silence of another kind. Across the Mediterranean, from the ruins of Crete to the shores of Sicily, traces of the clandestine war were buried under new flags and shifting politics. The world was eager to rebuild, to forget, but the stories of those who had fought unseen, those who had vanished into the depths of secrecy, refused to rest quietly. The hidden operations of the British Special Operations Executive in the Mediterranean had shaped the tide of war, yet their full story remained locked away, sealed in archives marked top secret, not to be released before 50 years. In the post-war years, fragments of truth began to surface. Some came through declassified files, others through the memories of aging veterans, finally able to speak. Historians poring over the dusty shelves of the Public Records Office at Kew began to uncover references to operations that had no official acknowledgement. Ships seized in neutral waters, corpses turned into decoys, bridges blown under foreign command. Each revelation added a new piece to the mosaic of Britain's hidden war. One such discovery came in 1977, when a researcher named Nigel West found a single folder labelled Operation Postmaster Confidential. Inside were reports from Lagos and Madrid, confirming that Churchill himself had personally authorised the raid on Fernando Po. The revelation stunned historians. For 35 years, the British government had denied any involvement. The captured ships, it turned out, had been used to gather intelligence on German convoy movements along the African coast. The operation had been not just an act of sabotage, but an espionage coup. 2 decades later, another veil was lifted. Files on Operation Mincemeat, once the most closely guarded secret of the war, were released to the public. Inside were photographs of Major William Martin, now known to have been Glinda Michael, the destitute Welshman who unwittingly became a hero. Letters between Ewan Montagu and senior intelligence officials revealed how even at the time, doubts lingered about the morality of the deception. "We played a dangerous game with truth and death," Montagu wrote in a private letter dated 1949. And yet, it worked. As these truths emerged, so too did the echoes of other, darker missions. Operation Albumen, the airfield raids on Crete, remained shrouded in uncertainty. Post-war German testimony confirmed the capture and execution of several British saboteurs, but their graves were never located. In 1960, an elderly Cretan shepherd claimed to have found remnants of British equipment in a ravine near Heraklion, charred, half buried in the soil. No one could say for certain if it belonged to Captain Cumberledge's lost team, but for the families of the missing, it was a haunting reminder that some stories of war end without closure. The political landscape, too, shifted beneath the legacy of these operations. In Greece, the same resistance factions united under Operation Harling soon turned their guns on each other, igniting a civil war that would last until 1949. In Spain, revelations of British espionage during neutrality threatened diplomatic relations for years. And on Crete, the scars of reprisals carried out by the Germans after the sabotage raids lingered long after the last shot was fired. Every act of covert warfare had its unseen cost. For those who had served in the SOE, secrecy was both a burden and a bond. Many went to their graves without ever receiving recognition. The organization itself was dissolved in 1946, its personnel absorbed into MI6 or demobilized without public acknowledgement. One former agent, interviewed anonymously in the 1980s, summarized it simply: "We didn't fight for medals, we fought for silence." Yet as the decades passed, the silence began to crack. Museums and memorials quietly appeared, in London, in Athens, in Valletta, each dedicated to the unsung agents who had fought in the Mediterranean shadows. At Gorgopotamos, a marble monument now stands at the site of the destroyed viaduct, bearing the inscription, "To those who fought together for freedom, unseen but never forgotten." Beneath it, the names of British and Greek fighters are etched side by side. The 21st century brought new light to the Mediterranean's secret war. Declassification efforts under the British National Archives Act revealed thousands of pages once hidden from public view. Scholars unearthed forgotten code names: Operation Husky Ghost, Operation Shinglebird, Operation Thesis. Many were small missions, acts of sabotage, reconnaissance, or psychological warfare, carried out with minimal resources but maximum risk. The cumulative effect of these efforts was immense. Each operation, no matter how obscure, contributed to weakening Axis control and preparing the ground for Allied invasions. And yet, not all mysteries were solved. Some files remain missing, others redacted beyond comprehension. References to lost teams in Malta and Cyprus hint at missions that ended in disappearance, their agents never accounted for. Whether captured, executed, or simply erased from the record, they became part of a silent brotherhood, the soldiers without graves, the ghosts of the Mediterranean. Today, historians describe the SOE's Mediterranean campaign as one of the most complex theaters of covert warfare in modern history. It was a battle fought not only with explosives and codebooks, but with trust, deception, and sacrifice. It blurred the line between heroism and secrecy, between victory and morality. In the end, the hidden British operations in the Mediterranean were not just footnotes to the Second World War. They were the invisible threads that tied its great turning points together. From the stolen ships of Fernando Po to the forged papers of a dead man off Spain, from the shattered bridge in Greece to the flames on Crete, these missions revealed a truth about war that no headline could ever capture, that sometimes history's most decisive victories are written in ink that fades before it is ever seen. And so, as we look back across the calm blue waters of the Mediterranean, we are reminded that its serenity hides stories carved in silence. Beneath those waves lie the traces of ships, planes, and men who vanished in service of a cause they could never claim. Their legacy endures not in glory, but in the quiet knowledge that they helped turn the tide of a world at war by fighting where no one could see them. The 5 most hidden British operations in the Mediterranean were never meant to be remembered, and that is precisely why they must never be forgotten.